Chapter 10, Information Technology Infrastructure Security Policies. Let's take a look at the learning objective and the key concepts for Chapter 10. The learning objective, we want to describe the different information system security policies, which we will do in the next few slides. And the key components or elements of an infrastructure security policy. The policies are associated with various domains of a typical IT infrastructure and the best practices in creating and maintaining IT policy. Anatomy of an infrastructure policy, page 1 of 3. 3 ways to organize policies. First is functional area. Creating policies by functional area of responsibility is a challenge. The advantage of this method is that the policies can be tailored for a specific audience. The disadvantage is that functional areas may change due to organizational realignment. This means policies may have to change too. Typically, organizing policies by functional area is the approach used in mature companies whose processes rarely change. Next is layers of security. Creating policies by layers of security is also a challenge. A core principle in information security is the concept often referred to as layers of security. Layered security or defense in depth, it's an infantry term, examples of layers are simple security controls placed within the network perimeter or firewall. In an operating system, a server, in code, an application, and in secure storage, a database, ideally these controls collectively provide layered security. The challenge is that technology is instantly changing and evolving. Additionally, the number of layers depends on the company. For example, should telecommunications be considered a perimeter layer or is its own layer? There is no one right answer or industry norm. The third approach is to organize policies by domains. The 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure are shown in Figure 10-1 in your book. This is one logical way to view requirements and policies. The 7 domains are a common taxonomy or classification system used across the industry. This taxonomy clearly illustrates how each domain can be used to create a layered security approach. For example, the workstation domain may involve pirated software. The LAN domain can scan emails for viruses, while the remote access domain deals with virtual private network, VPN tunnels. Different domains can have different security requirements. We were just talking in the previous slide about the autonomy of infrastructure policy, the layout in Figure 10-1, 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure, and this gives you a visual overview of that. The last page for the autonomy of an infrastructure policy, 5 common types of documents that capture the domain security control requirements are control standards, policy documents describing core security control requirements. Next is baseline standards, technical documents describing security controls for a specific technology. Thirdly, procedure documents, processes to implement control and baseline standards. Next is guidelines, optional documents that include recommended policies, standards, or procedures. And then you have the dictionary, a common taxonomy used in the policies that defines the scope and meaning of terms used. Format of a standard. Standard and process documents have a well-defined format and include sections like the following. Document number uniquely identifies the document and usually categorizes the document as a policy, standard, or procedure, or as a guidance. Title identifies the topic of the document. Version and date identifies the version and date of the document. Purpose provides measurable objectives and goals. Background explains why the standard was put in place. Standard process describes the standard or process to be implemented. Roles and responsibilities identifies who is responsible for implementation and adherence. Effective dates states when the standard must be implemented. Information assistance defines teams within the organization that can explain the standard and assist in coordinating its implementation. Approval specifies the approving authority. This can be either an individual executive or a group of individuals, such as a standards committee. Lastly, associated resources provides related resources. Workstation domain policies. Control standards are for workstations to establish core security requirements to harden these devices. The standards define how to manage the devices in a distributed environment, and they need to clarify to clearly communicate what responsibilities users have versus the responsibilities central administrators have. Workstation policies are often aligned to functional responsibilities. Baseline standards. With core policies defined, the focus then turns to how to configure the devices. Baseline standards provide the specific technology requirements for each device. IT staff use documented procedures to implement baseline standards. These configurations by devices ensure the following. They secure connectivity for remote devices, virus and malware protection, patch management capability, backup and recovery, hardening of the device, and encryption of the hard drive as needed. Next is procedures. This is for each baseline standard. You need a related procedure document. That does not mean every device configuration requires a unique procedure. Many of these configuration activities reuse the same procedure. The key to these procedures is to ensure that the administrators know how to access and apply the baseline configuration. If the tools and methods are substantially different, the process may be unique enough to require its own procedure. Guidelines are for implementing control standards, are useful to planners and managers. It's important to understand the difference between a guideline and a standard. A guideline is a strong recommendation. A standard is required control. A guideline recognizes that there are many acceptable ways to approach a problem, but provides one approach considered acceptable to the organization. The following guideline documents are useful when dealing with workstations, like acquisition guidelines, guidelines on active content, and mobile code. The mobile device domain policies. First is bring your own device, BYOD. This is a scenario in which employees bring whatever device they may have purchased and can connect at least to a guest network. This poses the greatest security risk, but is quite common. Next is choose your own device, CYOD. This is a situation wherein the organization provides a list of approved devices. If the employee purchases the device from that list, then they can attach the device to the organizational network. This provides some level of security. The company at least knows the device meets minimum security requirements. The next is company-owned and personally enabled, COPE. This is an approach wherein the company provides personal devices, most often phones, to employees who can also utilize the devices for personal use. This poses the most direct security because the company has a high degree of control over the device's security. However, when the employee exits, parsing the employee's personal data from the company data can be problematic. LAN domain policies. LAN security policies focus on connectivity, such as defining how devices attach to the network. The policies also define how to control traffic, such as through segmentation and router filtering. Let's look at control standards. Control standards for the LAN domain address a wide variety of connectivity issues, such as firewall controls, denial of service, DOS protection, and Wi-Fi security control. Wireless connectivity is also a part of the workstation domain. This is a good example of a cross-domain security issue. It also underscores the importance of configuring workstations and servers to protect data as it leaves a workstation and travels on a network. Network segmentation can be an effective control for limiting traffic and thus help keep hackers out. Review standards are also very important of vendors and organizations. The procedures include step-by-step configuration, response to audit processing failures, firewall port and protocol alerts, monitoring Wi-Fi APs, and the audit of record retention. Next is guidelines, acquisitions, preferred vendors, description of threats, and countermeasures. LAN to WAN domain policies, control standards, for example, has access control to the internet and traffic filtering. The industry has well-defined standards that require access control to the internet. As such, the standards tend to be specific about technologies and architectural choices. For example, these standards often require the use of Internet Proxy and Pacific Demilitarized Zone DMZ architecture. Next is baseline standards. Baseline standards, specific technology requirements for perimeter devices. A LAN to WAN domain baseline standard focuses on perimeter devices to separate the WAN from the LAN. The following are some examples: content blocking tools configuration standard, intrusion detection and prevention tools configuration standard, proximity server configuration standard, and firewall configuration standard. Guidelines include DMZ guidelines. Recommend additional services to be placed in the DMZ, and depending on those services, additional security requirements. Intrusion detection and prevention systems guidelines recommend how to design an IDS system of sensors, collection stations, and alert mechanisms to eliminate or reduce false positives. And then the content filtering guidelines recommend content filtering options, ways to maintain the list of banned sites, and ways to request access to blocked sites when needed. WAN domain policies. Let's look at the control standards. When do you see WAN-specific standards by address WAN management, domain name system, DNS, router security, protocols, and web services? The standards might call out specific security requirements for WAN devices, such as routers, switches, and wireless devices. A WAN control standard might include the following statements: the IS department shall approve all access points to the WAN. The IS department shall approve all physical and logical connections to the WAN that provide access to individuals or groups. The IS department shall approve all WAN-related address changes and configurations. Employees who plan to connect to the organization's network must first sign an agreement to abide by the requirements outlined in the WAN's security standard. Baseline standards. The lines between the baseline and control standards can blur in the WAN domain. The reason is that the topics tend to focus on specific technology solutions such as routers, protocols, and web services. Many organizations tend to focus on a small set of network vendors such as Cisco Systems or Jupiter Networks. Because the standards are often written with these technologies in mind, you can find a convergence of control and baseline standards in one document versus two. Next is procedures. Procedures in this domain need to focus on configuration and maintenance of the WAN. This may include specific configuration procedures for WAN devices such as routers and firewalls. These procedures track closely to change management procedures found in the LAN to WAN domain. For most organizations, the network team working on the LAN will be the same network team working on the WAN. As a result, you find the same procedures being used for LANs and WANs. Guidelines. Web services are an example of a WAN guideline. It describes when and how web services may be used. DNS management guidelines are another example that offers recommendations on the use of DNS within the LAN and WAN environments. Remote access domain policies. Start with control standards. The remote access domain standards include standards related to VPN connections and multi-factor authentication. For example, a VPN standard describes the security requirements for establishing an encrypted session. The following are examples of control statements you might find in this standard. They are adopted from the SANS Institute's Virtual Private Networks Policy document. Employees with VPN privileges must not share their VPN credentials to the organization's internal networks with unauthorized users. VPN use must be controlled using one-time password authentication. This may include a token device or a public-private key system with a strong passphrase. VPN users will be automatically disconnected from the organization network after 30 minutes of inactivity. Baseline standards include the VPN gateway options, VPN client options, Radius server security requirements standard. The VPN gateway option requirement standard it outlines the security configuration feature for the specific VPN concentrators used by the organization. The Radius server security requirement standard describes the security configuration of remote authentication dial-in user service. The guidelines for implementing control standards are useful to network administrators and access administrators who have responsibilities for remote access. These guidelines may outline various remote computing environments, such as working from home and methods of security. Remote access domain guidelines often reinforce security awareness training. System application domain policies. Control standards. With such a diverse set of security issues, many of the standards within this domain focus on classifying assets and assigning accountability. Accountability includes who owns key decisions over the assets and who maintains the security controls. This distinction between the owner and custodian of assets is in many standards. The owner is generally considered the ultimate authority on the use of a resource or data. This means approving the resources and data that are used. A custodian is someone with daily operational control over the use of resources and data. The custodian is generally responsible for ensuring that proper approved processes are used to secure and handle the resources of data. Baseline standards. You have the specific technology requirements for each device. You have the Public Infrastructure Certification Authority. This describes the public key infrastructure. Also describes how certificates are managed using CAs, approved cryptographic algorithms and key lengths standard. Describes the encryption algorithms and keys used, such as approved key lengths for symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. Physical security baseline standards. Describes the physical security technologies deployed. Examples are badge readers, electronic locks, cameras, and other monitoring systems. Each technology needs a baseline standard to describe which features should be implemented for what purposes and how to handle and manage the information generated by those devices. And developer coding standards. These describe how to write and test the security applications. The procedures are step-by-step configuration and change management. The guidelines is acquisitions, for example, preferred vendors, and description of threats and countermeasures. Telecommunications domain policies generally refers to any technology, service, or system that provides transmission of electronic data and information. Telecommunications may be wired or wireless. This includes voice and data networks, telephones, other wireless services, messaging, and directory services, high-speed data communication, facsimile devices, personal digital assistants, tablets, network servers, switches, or any other device, service, or system used in the transmission of electronic communication. The control standards. An essential control standard in this category is voice over IP. The voice over IP, this is the protocol to communicate between computers. These standards describe the security considerations and controls that apply to voice over IP network because of the ease of access to and prolific nature of voice over IP connections. There are growing technological risks. The telephone system was once isolated within an organization. Now technology risk. The telephone system was once isolated. This expanded use of the network services uses the same network as any other application. Use of Bluetooth communication standards and the use of other wireless. Procedures, step-by-step configurations. Details for reporting a lost or stolen employer-issued smartphone, and guidelines may include voice over IP systems architecture and security guidelines. Best practices for IT infrastructure security policies. The volume of infrastructure policies can be quite large depending on the organization's need. For example, the more diverse the technologies deployed, the greater the number of baseline standards required. It is important to define the requirements for standards in a methodical way. This chapter discusses the requirements based on domains. More than one approach works. Many organizations first select a framework such as ISO or COBIT. They then develop requirements and standards based on the framework. Do not reinvent the wheel. There are rare instances where you will need to develop original content to create a new policy. More often than not, though, you will modify an existing sample obtained from a reliable source. Before you create content for a specific topic, see what others have already done and adapt that work in your specific needs. Some sources for security policies and standards include the following. The U.S. government offers hundreds of standards through NIST. Private organizations such as SANS, professional associations offer security policy examples to their membership. And then you have to review and adapt them. Best practices for IT infrastructure security policies. Make policies and standards available to everybody. Keep content cohesive and keep the content coherent and maintain the same voice throughout it. Best practices for IT infrastructure security policies, page 3 of 3. Add only necessary information, stay on message, make your library searchable, and federate ownership to where it best belongs. Cloud security policies. International Organization for Standardization, ISO 27017, applies the guidance of ISO 27002 to the cloud and adds 7 new controls. Here they are. COD 6.3.1, Agreement on Shared or Divided Security Responsibilities between the customer and cloud provider. COD 8.1.5, how assets are returned or removed from the cloud when the contract is terminated. COD 9.5.1 is cloud provider must separate the customer's virtual environment from other customers or outside parties. COD 9.5.2, customer and the cloud provider both must ensure the virtual machines are hardened, means they're well protected. COD 12.1.5 states it is solely the customer's responsibility to define and manage administrative operations. COD 12.4.5, the cloud provider's capabilities must enable the customer to monitor their own cloud environment. And COD 13.1.4, the virtual network environment must be configured so that it at least meets the basic standards. Here are some case studies and examples. From the public sector, you got state of Texas agencies, coordinated attack using ransomware, email attachments. Several items could have mitigated this attack. More effective policies are needed regarding the attachments, and the common security concept of never trusting any data, regardless of environment, should have been applied to the managed service provider as a policy. Effective policies and training regarding employees recognizing social engineering. The next public sector is State of Maryland. It created a statewide technology infrastructure to support the electronic exchange of health records to reduce cost and improve the quality of patient treatment. Good example of not reinventing the wheel, the new statewide policies were likely based on the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, which can be viewed as the core security control standards, resulting in numerous baseline standards for the state's new infrastructure. Then you have the critical infrastructure, Televent, breach of internal firewall and network. A hacker installed malicious software and stole software related to Televent's core offering used by its customers. Showed a lack of adequate policy and or enforcement in the areas of network segmentation and the separation between the production and test environments. In summary, we covered the elements of an infrastructure security policy, the policies associated with various domains of a typical IT infrastructure, and the best practices in creating and maintaining IT policies. Thank you so much for listening to this slide.